done. There's research relative to the creation of pancreas activity and how to better regulate that. Where do we stand now with this?
So trying to promote the development of an artificial pancreas is a high priority for the agency. I'm a physician. If we can really crack the nut and have truly a replacement, if you will, for the pancreas for type 1 diabetes patients, it will be a huge advance in healthcare. We have already set up a special team who, by the way, is headed by someone who has type 1 diabetes, very invested in the technology. We've approved already 16 clinical trials. We've worked to help develop an sort of computer model that will allow the developers of these technologies to test drive their software algorithms without having to do animal studies, and so speed development. And in just a few weeks, we will be releasing a guidance document that lays out expectations for bringing the early generation of an artificial pancreas, low-glucose suspend devices, to market.
Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of research, and I think that we have made enormous gains. And so I wish you well with this one, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. The Chair would now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ranking Member Davis from Illinois. Dr. Shuren, thank you for appearing before us today. Couple quick questions, and Congressman Paulson alluded to this in his testimony, and it's probably fairly common with what most of us hear back home. The refrain is fairly similar. It's getting tougher and tougher, many of these constituents and companies say, to deal with the FDA. Delays, issues of transparency, issues of confusion have become real passionate concerns that have been voiced to many members of Congress. First quick broad question, do you hear similar concerns with some of the members in the industry?
We do hear similar concerns.
The second refrain that seems to be fairly common when I talk to my colleagues, because I hear this over and over back home, that it has become noticeably more difficult to work with and deal with the FDA in the last 2 to 3 years. Have you heard any sort of similar timeline concern as well?
I've heard concerns regarding interactions from some in industry. You know, interestingly enough, PwC did a survey, and they had reported, their respondents reported that 39% that felt that interactions had actually gotten better between industry and the agency, and the rest of the people who responded were somewhat neutral.
Can you clarify? Can you sort of broadly generalize, though, what the feedback you've gotten in the last 2 to 3 years?
And I can't say in the last 2 to 3 years, since I've only been at the center, for a little over a year and a half. So I kind of came in the middle of all of this. But the concerns in terms of interactions go along the following lines. First of all, they would like more interactions with us, and we agree. One of the challenges we have is that our requests for meetings before doing a clinical trial or submitting an application, we call them pre-submission meetings, has almost doubled in the past 5 years, but without the staff to actually make good on those commitments to have the meetings. We've heard, too, that there's a greater desire that when they get advice at a meeting, will the agency stand behind it? And in addition, that they have opportunities for more engagement with the center during the time of a review of an application.
One of the big points we've heard is that from folks in the FDA is that one of the reasons for the delays in product approval of the last 2 to 3 years is the poor quality submissions that device manufacturers are sending to the FDA. Poor quality, incomplete submissions. Are those contributing issues to the delay in product approval?
They are a contributing factor. We did an analysis of the letters we send to companies for 510K submissions. We call them additional information letters, and we looked at about 100 of them for 2010. And what we found is that for a little over 50% of the 510Ks we were receiving, we did have issues with poor quality. This would be that we put out a guidance document, a current guidance document, explained what our expectations were, and the company didn't follow it and also didn't justify why they didn't comply with the guidance, because they have flexibility, but they would have to then provide an alternative method. Or there was testing that they would conduct that was the same kind of testing you do for that kind of device. In some cases, a company even made that kind of device before, did that kind of testing, and now didn't do it, didn't submit it to us. No testing whatsoever. That's the kind of poor quality that we have seen. And it is a contributing factor, but it's not the only factor.
Okay. Again, according to the FDA's own data, A1 requests rose from, I think, 38% in 2001 to 77% in 2010. Total review times have risen 45% since 2007. And maybe you're saying this, it just doesn't seem plausible that those declines in FDA performance can all be put at the laps of the manufacturers. How much of the problem is with the FDA itself in this sort of declining performance? Maybe in not being clear what it requires in a submission, or that requirements are constantly changing? How much of a factor are those issues?
So first, just to clarify, our performance against the goals that we committed to meet with industry had actually overall improved over time, and we are meeting the goals for 510K. We're meeting one or close to meeting another goal for PMA, and that even over this time of MDUFA, we've seen improvement in our performance. However, there have been longer times overall from between our time and industry time, what we call total time. So the contributors, one is where we get submissions that they don't have the information they really should have and they know they should have. Now, in some cases, though, we do ask for things that we hadn't asked for before that are appropriate, and there are cases where we can do a better job communicating that beforehand. So one of the actions we're taking is to put out what we call a notice to industry letter, where we can quickly communicate if there's a change in expectations in the basis. I will tell you as well, to be frank, and that occurs about less than 10% of the time where we ask for additional, but we think appropriate. There are times, though, where when we went back on the analysis, where we found that we asked for additional information or we asked a question we shouldn't have asked. It's about less than 10% of the 510Ks, but that is concerning to us. And so we have already been starting to put in place changes into the program to address that, because we don't want to see that happen.
Last quick question, Mr. Chairman, then I know I'm running out of time. This is a pendulum. We want to make sure we've got quality products, and we want to promote innovation. Do you see at all that the pendulum the last few years has swung too far in one direction and it's stifling innovation?
I wouldn't exactly say the pendulum is swinging far one way versus the other. I think we've got multifactorial issues.
Are you concerned about innovation right now?
I do. I am concerned about innovation. I'm also concerned that we assure that the devices come on the market are safe and effective. What we ultimately want is, call it a pendulum or anything else, that the goalposts, if you will, aren't moving all that much, that we have a far more predictable program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjarlais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Shern. You're a physician. When did you last practice medicine?
In the 90s.
In the 90s? Okay. Certainly, then you've experienced the rise in healthcare costs that continue to increase yearly to a point where we're almost unsustainable. We see Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance going through the roof to where people just simply can't continue to go on. Do you recall when that change really started taking place in terms of rising costs? What would be your opinion on that?
That's outside my purview at the FDA, so I don't have an official opinion on that.
Okay. Well, I practiced for about 18 years, and through the 90s, the costs certainly increased, and there was an increase in regulation in the practice of medicine. There certainly has been an increase in pharmaceuticals, increase in devices, and And the FDA oversees this, and most people, whether it's in the medical industry or any other number of businesses, feel that burdensome federal regulations are causing increase in costs. So we were talking earlier about Europe, and on average, medical devices are approved two full years later in the U.S., and why did you say it takes so much longer for the FDA to approve these devices than the European firms?
Well, actually, if you look at the report from the California Healthcare Institute for 510K devices that don't have clinical data, and that's about 80% of the devices that we review, they come on the market in the U.S. first as compared to Europe at least half the time or more frequently. And in fact, the performance there looks like it's getting better in 2009 and 2010. Now, when we deal with the high-risk devices, the PMA devices, these are a lot of the implantable, life-saving technologies. Those devices have tended to come on the market in Europe before the U.S. for a very long period of time. And as mentioned beforehand, the standards there are very different. And with the global recession, companies now are looking to go to the market where it's easiest to get onto. Companies that are looking to sell where before you could sell before you got approved, now are being expected to get approved somewhere, and then you can get bought up. So the enticement to go to any country that has a lower standard is going to be greater. The solution here isn't for us to lower our standards. It's to get our program more predictable and efficient so that we can get innovative technologies to market more quickly, but we can assure that they're safe and effective, because if not, and as a physician, we put patients at risk. If we give to them a device, I don't know anyone here who wants a device that they don't know.
Are you familiar with the MAC-hour survey?
Yes.
Okay. It would contradict significantly what you're saying right now in terms of devices. Is that a credible study?
No, I have concerns with the MAC-hour study. It's actually less than 10% of the industry actually responded to it. Even of the population they were looking at is less than 20. Many of the questions had less than 10%. And if you compare the U.S. into the EU, at most less than 8% of the people they sent the survey to actually could have had the same product come on the market in the EU and in Europe. For some of the things where they try to make comparisons.
So you're saying the United States is actually quicker to get devices through than European companies?
So I think according, and I'm going by...
Well, it sounds the way you're spinning it.
So according to some of the reports from industry, some of these devices are actually coming on the market first in the U.S. as opposed to the EU. But for the high-risk devices, as a general matter for many years, they come on the market first in Europe, then in the U.S. Okay. It's a difference.
Now, these delays can cost these companies $20 to $40 million. Do you know the corresponding cost, what the corresponding cost is to patients of having delayed access to medical devices?
The cost of a delayed access for an ineffective medical device, I would say, would be huge, but not in favor of the patient. Look, as a doctor, if we have good technologies that are safe and effective, we want to get them out to patients. We also want to make sure they're safe and effective, because we don't do ourselves, we don't do patients, we don't do our healthcare system justice if we're getting out devices that are not effective. And in Europe, there have been a number of cases since the late 1990s where they approved a device and then later they actually did the studies and they found it was ineffective or unsafe.
Okay. Well, I'll interrupt just for a second, because I understand that you're defending the agency you work for, but as being a practicing physician at one time and myself being a practicing physician, I know that there's a line there that's being crossed on a federal level, and that we're driving up patient costs sometimes unnecessarily, and I know that a lot of patients feel the same way, again, whether it's pharmaceuticals or devices. And the United States is one of the most expensive places right now on health care, and we're going to have to do something about that. So, you know, the testimony that you're giving today sounds good from an FDA standpoint, but doesn't pass the practical test for me as a physician and many of my colleagues, but I appreciate your statement.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee. The Chair would now recognize the gentleman from the great state of North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Almost as great as the state of South Carolina, right, Mr. Chairman?
Almost.
Almost. Doctor, thank you for your testimony. We understand, you know, you've been on the job now for how long? How many months?
About 19.
19 months, okay. And, you know, we know that, you know, you're taking on an active agency, and so change often comes slow in government. And so we appreciate the position you're in. Now, you talked about the EU standards versus our standards, and getting a product to market in the EU versus here. It's a different process, right?
That's correct.
What is the safety record? Is there a difference in the safety record?
So one of the challenges with the EU is they do not have publicly available centralized database for that kind of information as you have here in the U.S. But we are aware of a number of cases of devices that got approved in Europe that subsequently were found to be ineffective or unsafe. A number of them were withdrawn from the market. A number
Do you have
were
any studies you could point to?
studies, no, but we have the cases.
Okay. Then
Well, I will say for
to my
studies that were
colleague
rep-
here,
Oh,
to
I'm
my colleague here, you had a problem with the statistical relevance of the Macauer study. You're saying it was only 10%, and so you're saying that study is not statistically sound.
In terms of the numbers that you look at.
Okay, then I would question you're saying that the EU has a lower safety standard or a worse safety standard than the U.S. if there's not relevant data.
Well, they have a lower standard to market because they do not require that a device be shown effective. And
Okay. So in terms of the effectiveness of our regulation, because we're not arguing that we have a government agency allow unsafe products that are not going to be helpful onto the market. Likewise, I want to ensure that my constituents have the access to the life-saving, whether it's devices or health care, or medicine, or procedures possible. So there is a balance, and I think I think we all care about that, maintaining that. But the difference in the Macauer report from Stanford, it took 31 months from first communication to be cleared to market here in the U.S. Like for low and moderate risk devices, it took 7 months in Europe. Can we reduce that gulf? What are you doing to reduce that 31-month time length?
So the comparison is apples to oranges. When they went in the EU, first of all, it's 15. It looks like it's 15 companies they got to respond
Okay.
on this.
Actually, let me ask you a question then. Let me ask you a question, because you don't like you don't really want to respond to the Stanford research.
No, I do
So
want to respond to it.
Well, you just want to dismiss it. So let me ask you this question. What is the average time from first communication to clearing to market for a device?
It depends what you mean on first communication. If it's from the application coming in the door, which is actually the comparison for Europe. So you're oftentimes, for those devices, not going to the notified body beforehand, and that's why it's apples and oranges. You'll come to us because you come to the
what
FDA
is
if you're
that?
going to do a clinical study.
Okay, so
if you're-
from first application to clearing to the market.
Yeah, so if you're talking about for a 510K, the average now is, and I'll double check on the exact numbers, it's around 140 days thereabout.
140 days. Okay, and what is that in Europe?
In Europe, we don't know. There's no publicly available data regarding the reviews that occur in Europe, both timeframes and the basis for the decisions. We have no idea what they even rely on when they make a decision in Europe.
So you're saying the Europeans are just in a different world when it comes to safety and soundness of medical devices, and there's no way for us to know a reasonable comparison.
They don't make that data available. In fact, the lack of transparency was recently criticized.
Okay, so let me ask you, are you happy with the length of time it takes from first communication to getting a device on market? Are you pleased with the track record so far?
Well, I'm not pleased with the time, and that's why we're taking actions to try to make this program more predictable, consistent, and transparent. It will require several things to get there. There are changes FDA has to make. There are things we need from industry. We need to get the quality submissions to us, and we want to work with industry on that. We need to have adequate and stable resources to do it. I will tell you, as comparison to the drug program, and I'm not suggesting the same by way of funding, but the user fees collected in drugs are 10 times the amount as for the device program. 10
Okay,
times
and also the revenue gained from that in the marketplace is significantly greater than that. But let me ask you another question. Is the length of time from submission well, from first communication to getting a device on the market, is that longer or shorter than it was 5 years ago?
The length of time for the total, our review times have gotten generally shorter.
They have?
They have overall for the different goals. The total time, our time, industry time, has lengthened for 510Ks. It's over the past few years remained roughly the same on PMAs.
Interesting, okay. Is it getting less costly or more costly?
I don't know.
Why don't you know?
Because we don't do cost analyses for what the manufacturers are doing.
Okay, so there is no cost estimate. The government would have no cost estimate of the regulatory hurdles that they're putting in place for industry.
No, I would not know of the total cost to a particular company, no.
Okay, that in itself, Mr. Chairman, I think is a problem when a government agency doesn't realize the impact they're having, because it's my constituents that are going to be paying this cost. It's passed along to consumers once we get the devices on the market. Look, I empathize with you. I do, but my concern is with the data that we've seen is that it takes longer now than it did just a few years ago to get a device on the market. And that is a big concern, and that's a big regulatory concern that I appreciate the fact that you're looking at that and trying to reduce that time, but I'd encourage you to look at the cost as well that industry is going to have to bear in order to comply with these regulations. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from North Carolina. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Dr. Gozar.
Dr. Shuren, I'm a dentist, and I'm very principled about process. I'm sure you're aware of the FDA's Regulatory Procedures Manual that just came out in March 2010?
I know of the manual, yes.
Okay, so, I mean, I'm coming back down to basics. Is there anywhere in the Regulatory Procedures Manual that a case study on how medical devices should be approved, whether they're Class 1, Class 2, Class 3?
To my knowledge, I'm not aware of that.
See, once again, these are fundamental problems, because what we have to do is we have to have everybody on the same line of expertise, what it takes for a 1, 2, and 3. So I take it that the staff is not trained in those procedure aspects.
No, in terms of how to treat the different devices, they are. But if you want to put out what you need to do for a particular device, there will be some differences depending upon the type of device. And this is why industry says to us, can you please put out more guidance on the specific types of devices to clarify what the expectations are? And we agree. There should be more guidance that's put out.
So you have a framework for these 501(k) reviewers?
We do have a framework for the 510K reviewers, and we're also right now doing a guidance in terms of clarifying that standard, because there's been confusion on some of our reviewers. We found that on our own analysis, and we've had confusion on the part of industry, and the best way to deal with that is to clarify that through guidance and then to have training on it.
So what kind of impact would that have on the endpoints that seem to randomly move with the reviewers?
Well, I think in terms of clarifying what the standards are and what needs to be done, you'll have far more consistency in both what we do and I think also what industry does.
Is there a way, or do you provide interaction, you know, like a how-to seminars where you actually have reviewers and manufacturers coming together and looking at this process? See, one of the things I'm seeing over and over again, I sit on natural resources as well as this government oversight, is this huge proliferation of agencies pending different checkpoints and time delays, because time is money, okay? And I heard you say something earlier about the pharmaceutical aspect, and you don't want to get me started there, because out in rural Arizona, we got problems. We can't even get medications properly for surgeries. We're actually rescheduling surgeries. So once again, we're not doing something good on the drug manufacturing as well. But when we're taking these delays, and there's venture capital is at a minimum here, and we have to have a return on investment. That's what the business model is talking about, and that's what my good friend over here was talking about and alluding to, is that we're forcing people to go to Europe because we're becoming so antiquated. We're not trying to work with people. We're trying to stymie the process. Because what I see here is, if you take statistics, you can juggle them any way you want to. It seems to me when the science is easy, you bring them here. When the science is hard, you go to Europe. So something is wrong there. And I agree. We're not comparing apples to apples, Europe to the United States. But we're forcing people to go to Europe because of the finances, because of the process. It's all of this. Does that make sense to you?
I understand the concern. I think to the extent that FDA, any unpredictability or inconsistency in our process that may contribute to companies making business decisions is something that we are trying to address. There's also the impact of the global recession. I will take responsibility for changes in weather patterns, but maybe not for the global recession. And that has also impacted the dollars that are available for investment and the decisions that are made. And that aspect of it is not in my control. But to the extent we can make the program more predictable and consistent, that's what we're trying to do with the actions that I laid out previously.
So wouldn't it be, I mean, no one wants a recall. So wouldn't it behoove us to work with industry, to sit down jointly in a venture to say, listen, there's limited capital. We definitely want to have the innovative spirit. We want to definitely keep that here. How do we streamline this? How do we work this? And it starts with basic building blocks. And it comes back to the basic building blocks of what business is about. And that's one thing I'm seeing constantly over and over again in government is a lack of business skills and understanding what it takes to actually get something to the market.
Actually, we've been going out to industry for a long time. This assessment that we talked about where we said, identify the root causes. Let's not do superficial surveys. Let's do the deep dive. We went out, we had significant engagement with the public. We had public meetings, 2 of them, 3 town hall meetings. I traveled around to different parts of the country, both in open meetings and in closed-door meetings with different groups. We had 3 public dockets available for comments. And we got comments on the assessment, we made recommendations, we got comments on those, and based upon all of that input over a period of time and analyses is when we then put out the different actions we'll take, and that is more guidance. That's more training for our folks. That's different changes in the procedures and the processes within the center.
Well, then it seems like you're gathering the information, but then it's implementation. So let me give you an example. In July 2010, the Advancing Patient Safety Coalition, which is made up of patients facing groups such as the American Hospital Association, the American Nurses Association, wrote a letter to the FDA Commissioner Hamburg asking for a firm timetable for the FDA to establish a unique device identifier system. It is widely understood that a system of UDIs for medical devices would improve patient safety, prove clarification for medical device users, and make the recall process more efficient. Yet, over 9 months after this letter and 4 years after the passage of the FDA Amendment Act, we have no UDI uniform rule. When will you be putting the regulations for this unique device out? And why is it taking so long?
This year, the rule is in administration clearance. It will be out this year.
Can you be a little bit more specific? Because, I mean, it's just, there's not these timetables. There is no fixation about timetables. They just continue to be pushed and pushed and pushed.
For right now, it's in a process that's outside of my control, so I can't give you the exact date when it will come out, but it's been a high priority for us.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona. Dr. Shuren, I want to start by commending you for doing something that I haven't seen in the brief time I've been here, which is acknowledge that there may be problems with the agency that you sit there representing. It may not be unique, but it's certainly unusual to have someone do that. So with respect to that, I think, and I hope I'm using your words, unpredictable, inconsistent, and opaque. The opaque may not be your word. It may. I've certainly heard you use the word unpredictable and inconsistent. I think in your written testimony, you just simply acknowledge the FDA recognizes it can do a better job. My question to you, or let me first ask you this first. You solicited input from industry on how FDA can improve itself, correct?
That's correct.
And how many recommendations would you say that you got back that had merit?
We'd have to go back and check. I will say we got a limited number of recommendations from different groups. Most of it was feedback to the recommendations that we put out.
All right. Again, I stand to be corrected. it strikes me that of the recommendations you received or the recommendations that you seek to implement, you're going to use a quote, case-by-case analysis. Now, I want to ask you to put on your other hat, your JD hat. There's nothing in the world less predictable than a case-by-case analysis. It frustrates law enforcement. I suspect it frustrates industry. What bright line, reformative measures came out of that survey?